Society in Battle, Rhode Island welcome you to the last talk of the 2024 lecture series. We thank Massachusetts Society of Cincinnati for sponsoring this talk. Our speaker is N Hagist, managing editor for the Journal of the American Revolution. Don is an avid historical researcher and has spent much of his life studying and researching the history of the American Revolution, focusing on the British soldiers who served in America during that war. He has published numerous articles and 8 books on the British and the Revolutionary War. His presentation tonight is British Soldiers, American War, Voices of the American Revolution. Very few British soldiers who served America left their own writings. This lecture, based on his 2014 book of the same title, presents 9 of these rare accounts, along with extensive research to put each man's experience into context. Don is an engineer for a major medical device manufacturer and also writes humor material for syndicated cartoonists. He lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Thank you, Don.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for coming out on such a lovely evening to hear me ramble about things like this. As he pointed out, I study British soldiers who served in the American Revolution, and my real focus, the ones I really like to study the most, are the British soldiers who served right here in Rhode Island during the American Revolution, studying them as individual people rather than just broad generalities. But that's not what I'm going to talk about here tonight. I wrote a book, this book. Well, actually, the book is smaller than this. It's down there. It's not that big. But it's about soldiers served in the American Revolution. And usually when people give a book talk, they do readings from the book. And I figure that would be silly because you're all going to read the book anyway, right? So there's no point in me reading it to you. But instead, I like to talk about how the book came about. You know, what was the process of going from an idea about a book to actually having a book. So the premise here is that about 50,000 British soldiers served in the American Revolution. Now that's numbers of individual people. There weren't that many here at any given time. You know, there were different 10,000 in Boston when the war began, and then more here, fewer there. About 5,000 served in Rhode Island. But for example, some of the British soldiers who served in Rhode Island had also served on General Burgoyne's Saratoga campaign. So you get numbers in one place and numbers in the other place, and often don't recognize that some of them are the same people. So about 50,000 during the war. I got interested in them when I was a teenager, and when I started looking for literature, I found that there wasn't very much literature on these soldiers, and a lot of the literature that was out there didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. They tend to just treat them as a homogeneous mass of people and treat them like the bad guys, right? And I wanted to get past that. You know, who were the actual people? So there were some studies out there that look at the British soldiers and try to figure out, what do all these 50,000 people have in common? And I look at this and I think, well, what does everybody in this room have in common, right? You know, well, you're all interested in the American Revolution, you all came to this lecture, you're all going to read my book, but once you get past that, think about yourself as an individual and say, if somebody was going to include you in a history and they included about you only the things you have in common with everybody else, how good a picture of you would they get, right? I want to know how these people are different from each other, not how they're all the same. So we're going to start just with an example of one soldier. This is not a guy who is in the book, but this is a guy I put in because of the audience we have here tonight. John Hunt was born in 1747 in St. Philip's, Birmingham, Warwickshire in England. He was a laborer, which means he didn't have a skilled trade. He enlisted in the 43rd Regiment of Foot at the age of 23 in 1770. That was a very, very typical enlistment age for British soldiers who served in the American Revolution. If you were to plot a graph, everybody here likes graphs and numbers, right? And say, okay, what were the enlistment ages like, and plot it as a curve, you'd start around 15. Very few soldiers enlisted at 15, but a few did. Actually, some even younger, special circumstances. And your curve would go up through 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, all the way out to, I know one soldier who served in Rhode Island who enlisted at the age of 45, for example. But that was really rare. Most of the guys who enlisted in their early 20s, all right? And he was one of them. And the 43rd Regiment may sound familiar if you know the Battle of Rhode Island, because they were engaged here, and John Hunt was severely wounded in the left leg and right hand in the Battle of Rhode Island on August 29th. So what does that do to his career as a soldier? Well, it turns out it doesn't really do anything. He recovers from his wounds. He stays in the Army. He serves for the rest of the war. And in fact, sometime after the war, he transfers into another British regiment and gets deployed overseas again. Continues to serve in the 13th Regiment of Foot until April 2nd, 1793, when he's discharged on the island of Jamaica. He goes back home to Great Britain. He's totally worn out from long servitude. And he gets an Army pension. And now what do you suppose he does? It's 1793, so he's, what, do the math, 46 years old. He served in the Army since he was 23. Well, he does what the majority of British soldiers do after they get discharged. He goes back into the Army again. He joined a company of invalids while he's worn out from long servitude, which means he can't deploy overseas anymore, but he can still serve in the Army. So he serves in an invalid battalion, which stays home, garrisons forts and local positions. Discharged at August 1800. Now he has old age and various infirmities. He served 30 years in the Army. And the challenge I have when I want to pick a guy or two to put up on a slide like this, I want to look for these guys with long careers. It's not finding somebody with a career like this. It's figuring out which one among thousands to choose, because this is a very typical career for a British soldier who served in the American Revolution. They were mostly career soldiers, and they very, very often had careers of 30 and more years in the Army. So this time, if a soldier like him who was in Rhode Island for 3 years, that's only a small part of his military experience. Now let's get to the book. The idea for this book started with another book, a soldier named Roger Lamb. Anybody heard this name before, if you're really deep in the American Revolution? He was a British soldier who served in the 9th Regiment of Foot on Burgoyne's campaign, and then later in the 23rd Regiment of Foot on Cornwallis's campaign, which means he got captured and became a prisoner of war twice, and he escaped and got back to his own army twice. And the most remarkable thing is he wrote a book twice. He wrote 2 books after the war, the most extensive writings of any British soldier. He wrote a lot about his own experiences, but he also wrote about a lot of other things that were not his own experiences. So I took his 2 books and abridged them to just write about a British soldier's story. It was published in 2004, abridgment of his 2 books, and then I'm happy to say that since then more information came out about him, so there's a new version of it out. But the point of all this is I gave a talk about this book in 2005 at Saratoga National Historical Park. And what you see here is an actual historical artifact. This is a slide from that presentation that I gave 19 years ago. The slide says there are only 4 narratives of British soldiers known to exist. And I was very happy to say that. See, I just published one by Roger Lamb, and then there's this guy George Fox and John Robert Shaw, or Robert Shaw, depending on how you write it, and Thomas Sullivan. 3 of the 4 were published as books, and 1 as an article in a magazine. And I said, okay, here's the premise. And of course, after the talk back in 2005, I said there's only 4 narratives by British soldiers, 50,000 guys. After the talk, a guy comes up to me and says, you know, there's another one. I said, oh, how about that? And he tells me about this guy named William Crawford, who wrote a memoir that was published in 1823 as a pamphlet. And as far as I can tell, there's only 1 or 2 copies of it still in existence. But that was kind of cool. And he was a British cavalryman. When the American War started, he volunteered to leave the cavalry to serve in the infantry to go overseas and fight in the war, because the British, for the most part, didn't send cavalry to America. They sent infantry. A few exceptions, but mostly. So he wanted to serve in the war. He took a cut in pay, and he decided to serve in the infantry. And I said, wow, so now I've got a fifth memoir. There's Roger Lamb's narrative, which I had already published, but now I got these four others, and each of the soldiers had very different careers from each other. If you look at those five now, you can't make any generalities about what a soldier's career was like, because they're vastly different. But I thought, wow, it'd be neat to have these in one place, these new, we already have Roger Lamb's, these other four, because they're shorter. So I started talking up the idea to other researchers, and lo and behold, through my own research and the help with other people, in the next 2 years, 6 more narratives. A colleague alerted me to 2, we found a third jointly, another, blah, 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 I found some. But suddenly now I have 9 narratives of British soldiers. When before I had said there were only 4 in existence, now I have a total of 11 and 9 that kind of need to be published somehow, so I got enough for a book. And because of all these differences, and because each narrative emphasized something different, one guy talks a lot about his enlistment and training, another guy talks a lot about his experience in battle, another guy talks a lot about being a prisoner of war, this and that, and the other thing, you can actually make a bigger picture out of the smaller pictures. I said, now I got something. So I have 9 narratives, each that highlights a different facet of a military career. And I'm a research geek, so I said this is also a chance to go blah-bitty, blah-bitty, blah about all this other information I found, things about other soldiers, and put all this stuff into a context. Because for each guy, if I know, say, how old he was, that's nice, but I'd like to know, well, how does that fit in with everybody around him? Was that a typical age or an unusual age? So I include all this analysis in each chapter of the book. And what do we mean by this? Well, we're going to do an example of the kind of analysis that's in this book. How old was a British soldier? Well, here in Rhode Island in 1778, when the Battle of Rhode Island occurred, there were about 450 soldiers in the 22nd Regiment of Foot, one of the ones that was serving here. And so far, I've been able to determine the ages of 233 of those men. Just over half. So that's a pretty good statistical sample, I hope. Has anybody here played the British soldier age game before? Anybody? All right, we're going to play it now. So we have 233 men, British soldiers. They're here in Rhode Island. And how many of those do you suppose are between the ages of 15 and 20 years old? Anybody? You can answer as a number or a percentage. This is what? 10%? 5%? Okay. The answer is 17 men altogether. So that's under 10% of them. How many do you suppose are going to be between the ages of 21 and 25 years old? Soldiers, Army, okay. Pardon? 20%? So the answer is 21 men altogether. So now we've got 15 to 25 years old. We've only accounted for just under 40 of our sample of 223. That's under 20%. How many of them are between the ages of 26 and 30 years old? 50, okay. That's 38 altogether. Up to 30 years old, we got way less than half already, right? 31 to 35 years old? People don't even want to answer anymore. Well, now we're getting in the sweet spot. Now it's about 73. Now we got a pretty big number. 36 to 40, we have 42 of them. 41 to 45, 22, 9 between 46 and 50, and 1 51 to 55 years old. These are the guys who were in the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778. This is the age range. These were not young guys just out of wherever you come just out of and go in the army and go right overseas and start fighting. These were mostly career soldiers. And because they're career soldiers, they serve from their late teens or early 20s well into their 40s before they're no longer fit for service. If we take any British regiment, almost any British regiment that served in the American Revolution, and grab a random guy out of the ranks, he's going to be somewhere between the ages of 25 and 45 years old. almost for sure, with about 20% of them over the age of 40 and about 20% of them under the age of 25, but most of them are in that 25 to 40-year-old range. So this is the kind of material that puts the individual narratives into context. So let's look at the 9 soldiers and 9 stories here quickly. We've got John Robert Shaw. He was from Yorkshire. His father was a stuff weaver as a profession, and his father wanted him to go on in the family business, and he wanted none of that. So he ran away to join the army. That probably has never happened again since then, right? And we have William Crawford, the cavalryman who volunteered to join the infantry so he could serve in America. In researching him, I went to British military records and looked at all the cavalry regiments and all the cavalry who volunteered. Turned out there were about 400 or 500 or so men who did the same thing he did. Valentine Duckett was a wanderer who wandered into the army, and he kind of wandered out of it again. And guess what happens when you wander out of the army without permission? Yeah, it doesn't end well. Thomas Watson joined the army to get a better life and an education. He was a young man from Cheshire. He started working in the coal mines at the age of 7. Well, by the time he was about 15, he had had enough of that, no surprise, and he joined the army to get a better life than being in the coal mines. Robert Young was a long-serving soldier who volunteered for service in America. Ebenezer Fox was an American prisoner of war. You know the prison ships that you hear a lot about, the prison ship Jersey and whatnot? He got captured. He was a privateersman. I think he was from Rhode Island, if I remember correctly. Got thrown on the prison ship. How do you get off a prison ship? Enlist in the British Army. And off he went to the West Indies. George Fox, no relation, campaigned for 1.5 years in the war and was a prisoner of war for 5 years. So he spent a lot more time as a prisoner than he did working as a soldier. Alexander Andrew was a servant to a general officer, which gives him a distinctive perspective. And William Burke was a young soldier who aspired to become an officer, which could happen during this time period, but it wasn't very likely, as William Burke found out. So the 9 narratives. Here's one of them, Thomas Watson's narrative. He was a soldier who served in the 23rd Regiment of Foot. And eventually a memoir about him was published after he died, based on his own account of himself. This copy is in the Nantucket Historical Society. It's pretty hard to find these days. Each one was published in some form or another, but most of them are exceedingly rare today. Some were memoirs, some were letters, some were broadsides. And for some of them, I abridged them to include only the parts of their lives. Like Thomas Watson went on to become a Quaker preacher and Quaker evangelist in New England after the war, and most of his book talks about that. And I thought, you know, that's interesting if you want to study that, but this is kind of a book about soldiers and their military careers, so abridgment time, right? The book includes a bunch of original illustrations by my colleague Eric Schnitzer, who's the park historian at Saratoga National Historical Park, but he's also a very talented artist. And he's an expert on the material culture and clothing of the period and the visual aspects of the time period. So he's a good one at rendering soldiers. And what I wanted for this book was pictures not of soldiers standing at attention in their dress uniforms, which they probably hardly ever did, but looking like they may have actually looked at some point during their career. So in this point, this is John Robert Shaw, as he may have looked as a prisoner of war. So inspired again by original artwork and trying to get things that carried the style of the time period, looking at original artifacts to incorporate that material into the pictures. And again, in their day-to-day activities, not their formal activities. I used a lot of other documents. I'm a research geek, as I said. I've spent a lot of time in archives in Great Britain and in Canada, as well as in the United States. Primary sources are all I use to do my work because you can't trust the secondary sources very much. A lot of them are terrible. And Even if they're really good, why not say, well, where did this guy get their information? And look at that instead. So here's an example. These are British Army muster rolls. A lot of that stuff I talked about, soldiers in the 22nd Regiment, starts with the muster rolls, which gives the names of every soldier who served in every British regiment. And if you trace through them, you can see when they joined the Army and when they left the Army, and maybe anything remarkable that happened in between. There are these great big documents. That's a photograph on a table in the British National Archives just outside of London. And here's an example of where the information from muster rolls comes very useful. One of the guys in the book is a soldier named Alexander Andrew, who was present at the Battle of Germantown. He was a servant to a British general officer who was killed in that battle, so he has a very distinctive perspective on the battle, of course. But one of the things that he wrote in his narrative, he says, I came into the Army in place of a brother of mine who was cunning enough to persuade me, young and foolish, to go in his place. Well, during this era, in peacetime Great Britain, before the war began, if you enlisted in the Army and you hated it, you could get out of your enlistment if you could find a replacement. I can't serve anymore, but here's somebody who can. So this guy said, well, I didn't enlist in the Army. My older brother enlisted, and then he sent me to go in his place. Well, the muster rolls from the 44th Regiment of Foot, sure enough, show, I don't know how well you might be able to see that, because I can't find it. There we go. Can I find the pointer? There it is. We've got Alexander Andrew entertained, which means enlisted, on September 15th, 1772, and right under that, William Andrew discharged the day before. So sure enough, the muster roll confirms exactly what he wrote in his narrative, that his brother, William, left the regiment and he went in his place. That's kind of cool. Discharges of soldiers. The only discharges of British soldiers that survive are for those who got pensions. A discharge was a document that you get. Remember I said these are career soldiers and bad things happen to you if you leave the Army without permission. So a discharge is a document that you get when you're done with your service that says you're legally done with your service obligation. You can go home. You can't be picked up as a deserter anymore. If somebody's suspicious of who you are, you flash your discharge. See? Not in the Army anymore. There's a whole lot of these in Great Britain. Only for soldiers who received pensions, because that's why their discharges ended up on file and they survive today. And luckily, a few of the guys in this book, namely Alexander Andrew, his discharge survives. Proof of completion of service, I said that. Available for only 2 of the soldiers in the book, but that's better than none. But I've read well over 10,000 of these because they give the information to put all the other soldiers in context. The discharge, it's a little small to read, but it's got his years of service, it's got his age, it's got his height, it's got his trade, it's got his place of birth. It's got a little statement up there that says he was wounded in the Battle of Germantown in October 1777, which is really cool. The information at the beginning of this talk about John Hunt also came from his discharge, where it said that he was wounded in the Battle of Rhode Island. So this kind of stuff gives great detail. Court-martial proceedings. 2 of the guys in the book were tried by court-martials for pretty significant crimes. They weren't necessarily found guilty. They give a lot of vignettes. A really great thing about a court proceeding, if you find, for example, a letter home that says, here's some stuff that I did, that's really nice. But if you find a court proceeding, you get, here's what this person says about what happened. Now here's this person's version. Now here's this person's version and another person's version. And then you can really get a nice picture of what happened. Now most of the time it's some benign thing like a theft or some other crime. You don't get the really exciting stuff like how did the battle go. But you get these nice vignettes. And from other proceedings, again, I've read about well over 1,000 of these things too, and they provide a lot of context for what common experiences soldiers had, and lots and lots and lots of other documents. This is another bundle of documents in the British National Archives. You've heard the expression having to go through a lot of red tape to get to something, and that expression, that this is true, comes from the archival tape that's used to bind documents together to put them on file. These documents are bound in faded red tape, and I went through all of it. And another reason you should think about getting one of my books is so I'll be able to pay for the respiratory ailments that I'm probably going to contract from going through these things in these old archives, because I did in fact unfold and read every single one of those documents and then fold them up and put them back in the box again. And that was one of many, many, many boxes. Orderly books, letters, narratives of other soldiers, punishment books, deserter examinations, depositions, all kinds of documents that tell us a great deal of information about British soldiers. So what did I learn about these 9 guys? Well, I learned their nationalities. We had 4 Englishmen, 1 Scotsman, 3 Irishmen, and 1 American in the batch. All, again, who served in the British Army. Well, how does that plug into the Army in general? The Army in general was about 50% English, 25% Scottish, 20% Irish, and 5% foreign, which is mostly German or other continental European. This is, again, just the British soldiers. I'm not talking about loyalists or Hessians or any of those, but just in the British Army. So I don't really have among these 9 narratives an accurate demographic sample, which is why it's really important to put in the book. This is not an accurate demographic sample, because otherwise you might think it is, right? I learned about trades. Among the guys in the book, we have one guy who was a weaver, and then later he became a well digger, a stone cutter who later became a farmer, a husbandman who is a farmer who tends to animals rather than tending to crops. What else does it say up there? A miner who then became a religious person. He wasn't a clergyman, but he was an evangelist. A clerk who became a schoolmaster. Well, that one fits in pretty well. And a surprising number of British soldiers went on to become schoolmasters in America. A barber, a potter, a laborer who became a servant eventually, and a steward who became a clerk. So most of these guys had some kind of an actual trade or some kind of a higher skill. But in the Army in general, it was about 55% tradesmen and about 45% laborers. How do I know that? Remember those thousands of pension documents that say the trades? That's how we know. All right. Literacy. It's pretty common to assume that most British soldiers were illiterate, and that does not seem to be an accurate assumption. Well, I'm working with British soldiers' narratives, so clearly there's a tendency for literacy in this small sample. 5 of the people actually talk about their own education in their youth, so they went to school before they joined the Army. One of them received his education in the Army. And the book has a whole section about schools within British regiments and the value that the British military placed on education during this time period. One of them was clearly literate, even though he doesn't talk about it. He wrote his own narrative, so he must have been somewhat literate. One of them dictated his memoir when he was very late in his life, so we don't know if he was unable to write at all or if he was just old enough and infirm enough that he wasn't able to write. One of them we just can't tell. But in the Army in general, again, if we go back to those pension documents, they have signatures, or they have the soldier's mark, and about 55% of them bear signatures. Now, we can argue a lot about whether a signature alone qualifies the man as being literate, because some people could write only their name, but it's the only large sample of material we have to go on to suggest literacy. So based on that, we can kind of guess that maybe 55% are literate. So what do all these guys have in common? Well, they were all volunteers, which is another important thing to recognize about British soldiers in the American Revolution, is most of them were volunteers. By most, I mean something on the order of between 98 and 99.5%, like almost all of them were volunteers. We know this because it was not legal for most of the war to press soldiers into the Army or give them involuntary service. All the British soldiers who served in Rhode Island were volunteer soldiers, by the way. And I can talk more about that if anybody wants to hear more about it. All of them were soldiers, obviously, and every one of them had their own distinctive story, which is why I really like them so much. Thank you very much. I talked about the book a bit. If anybody wants to contact me directly, my email address If you like these stories about individual British soldiers, I have a blog, and I feature a lot of them on them, not only about soldiers, but also about soldiers' wives and soldiers' children in America. And I'm the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, which you can read absolutely free because it's an online publication. Highly recommended. And I have copies of the book up here if anybody's interested. I also have another book of mine, a more recent one called Noble Volunteers, which is more of a broad study of soldiers in the Army in general, rather than being built around the narratives of some individuals. And I'll be happy now to take any questions people might have.
How many of the soldiers remained in the States rather than going back to England?
How many British soldiers remained in the States rather than going back to England? That's a number I'm working on, and I haven't figured it out precisely yet, but it's somewhere on the order of 2,500 to 5,000 out of about 50,000 altogether. But there's some qualifiers about it. What do you think it takes to remain in the States? Does that mean they deserted from the Army? What does that really mean? Well, there's some different circumstances that cause people to remain in the States. The most important one is that when the war ended, during the war, what always happens to an army during a war? It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, especially in this war when, by the end of the war, Great Britain was fighting the United States and France and Spain and Holland. Lots and lots of enemies all over the place. So the army got really, really big, and then they signed this big peace treaty. Now they can go back on a peace footing. What do we do with all these soldiers? So at the end of the war, all the British soldiers, who by this time were almost all in New York, were given a choice. Well, not all of them, but all of them who were eligible were given the choice. You can either take your discharge here in America and leave, or you can go back to Great Britain and take your discharge there. Or if you enlisted under certain qualifiers, which are explained in the book, you can take a land grant in Nova Scotia. Now, when the war began, they said you can take a land grant in America, and they were probably thinking like Pennsylvania or Virginia. But when the war ended, you got Nova Scotia. But there were choices that the soldiers could make. So some soldiers did say, wow, this big country, lots of land, people speak the same language I do, and they decided to settle here. But we have to look more carefully at the numbers. If I take the 22nd Regiment, the one that was here in Rhode Island, for example, and I look at the muster rolls at the end of the war, and I say, wow, look at all these guys who were discharged in New York, and they took the option to be discharged right away. 66 guys that said, okay, we can leave here in New York. But then I have to look more carefully, because a lot of these British regiments in New York went to Canada, because that's still a British Dominion, right? And 44 of those 66 men who took their discharge in New York re-enlisted within the next 2 days into regiments going to Canada, which says a lot about being a British soldier as a career. You're in New York and you can just walk away. You just served in a whole war. You can stay in the Army or leave. And 2/3 of the ones who had the option of just leaving chose to re-enlist and stay in the Army. Some British soldiers who became prisoners of war at places like Saratoga or Yorktown or a few others never came back from captivity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they settled happily in America, because some of them escaped captivity and disappeared altogether. And try as I might, there's a few cases where I know about soldiers who died in captivity, because British soldiers died in captivity too. Some escaped, made their way back to the British Army, but we get individual cases, for example, where a regiment in New York says, okay, all the prisoners came back and we got like 80% of the prisoners have returned, the others didn't come back, we write them off as deserters. But then later in some place like Jamaica, one of those soldiers shows up and joins a British regiment there because he escaped and made his way. So it's hard to pin down. We can tell how many left the Army at the end of the war in America, but we can't be sure that they all just stayed here. is what I'm getting at. It's really hard to pin down a precise number, but I'm thinking between 2,000 and 5,000.
Do you have numbers, like rough numbers on Burgoyne's surrendered army? Like,
Oh, I have very specific numbers on Brazilian surrender army, but can you be more specific with the question?
after they got captured,
Okay.
they got marched out of it. So by and large,
Okay.
like, aggregate.
Okay, so Burgoyne's army, first off, just for context, in 1777, the British said, well, we have an opportunity to kind of split off New England from the rest of the colonies by capturing Lake Champlain and then the top part of the Hudson River all the way down to Albany. And everything from Albany south is navigable by the Royal Navy. So if we can just capture everything north of Albany and hold on to it, we can kind of separate this. So an army comes down from Canada under a guy named General Burgoyne. They get almost to Albany, but they get hung up at a place called Saratoga. They fight a lot of battles, things happen. They end up surrendering. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. About 5,000 British soldiers surrendered, and some German soldiers, and some loyalists, but I'm focusing only on the British ones. They get surrendered, but Burgoyne, being a clever fellow, works out an arrangement where he says, okay, we'll surrender if you just let us go back to Great Britain and never fight in the war again. And the Americans say, okay, that's fine. We'll send you to Boston, and then you can get on ships and go home. So these guys, now it's October and into November, walk from Saratoga to just outside of Boston, which is not an easy walk, but they do it. But heck, they just walked from Quebec down to Saratoga, so they're used to this kind of thing. They get put up in barracks outside of Boston, and the Continental Congress says, whoa, we can't just send these guys home, because all that'll happen is the British will just replace them with other soldiers. If we want to really put pressure on the British government and their army, we have to keep these guys. So the Americans break the convention, and there's a whole lot of back and forth about whose fault that really was. But the soldiers now who spent a winter and part of a summer in crude barracks outside of Boston, instead of going home, then get sent to, where did they get sent first? To Virginia. So now they have to walk from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Virginia, and they do it. And then they're in Virginia, and then another British army invades the South. They say, oh boy, these guys could get freed up. Now we're going to send them into western Pennsylvania, out to Lancaster. So they walk from Virginia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. By 1783, there are just under 1,000 of these British soldiers still left of the 5,000 who surrendered. What happened to all the other ones? Well, some of them died in captivity, but a lot of them escaped. And of those who escaped, do you know what happened to them?
They just filtered into society.
They filtered into society. Actually, they filtered into many of them filtered into the Continental Army, from which they then deserted and filtered into the British Army. About 20 of them fought in the Battle of Rhode Island. I can give you their names if you'd like, because some of them escaped from those barracks outside of Cambridge and got right back and got into Rhode Island, because that's not very far away. Some other ones made that journey. Many of them joined the Continental Army immediately, and as soon as they got to the front lines, off they went and they rejoined. They rejoined the British Army in droves. So you'll see a lot that talk about, oh, the army just evaporated, but these guys are career soldiers, and a lot of them were really determined. I can document, again, the names and in some cases tracing the paths of about 1,000 of them that got right back into the British Army. And then there's about 1,000 of them still in captivity. And then there's some that's a lot harder to determine. Some made their way back into Canada, rejoined British regiments there, which then the regiments they don't know that this happened. Communication isn't that precise. So it takes a lot of piecing together. But a very large number of these prisoners of war escaped and got right back into the British Army. Well, not right back. Sometimes it took them a couple of years to get the whole way. But they went back and served in the British Army again. That was an interesting question. There was one over here right at the beginning.
So Don, being an engineer, do you have all this in a database?
Well, I don't have it. That's a good question. I am an engineer, and you may have discerned that I like to play with numbers a lot. I don't have it in a database, that would be neat, but I am slowly but surely cataloging individual regiments. So it's coming along, but it's brutally time consuming. I put my focus initially on the 22nd Regiment that served here in Rhode Island. That's why I have a lot of those stats. I've more recently gotten more detail on the 43rd, the 38th that were here, and a few other regiments I've singled out because for one reason or another they're archetypical. They're not archetypical, they're interesting to me, so I singled them out. There's an awful lot more that can be done. I'm trying to get other people to help with it, but when you have something that's really tediously exhausting and other people say, oh, sure, I'd love to help, until they actually start doing it, and then they decide they don't want to help so much. But we're getting there, finding out more little bits. But the really cool stuff is not so much the database, it's the individuals who are really cool. My current project that I'm working on is a companion book. If you want to know about British soldiers in general, like how the Army was structured and what a career of soldiers might be like, this is the book to have. Noble Volunteers. It's just all about the kinds of career paths British soldiers could have, and what they're, if you want to know fascinating things like what were the odds of becoming a corporal in the British Army or serving your whole 30 years as a private soldier, that kind of stuff is in there, but in the context of individuals, how the training was done, how recruitment was done, what happens at the end of your career. But I'm working right now on the companion book to that, which is about the wives of British soldiers who were in America with the Army. Because that's one of my favorite topics, because, well, if you want to read about this, where else are you going to go? It just isn't there. And yet, if you look at the primary sources that I talked about, the orderly books, the day-to-day Army orders, the artwork from the time period that shows what armies looked like, there's women in all of them. There are women. You cannot study the British Army in this time period without finding information about the wives of the soldiers. And yet nobody's really done anything to compile it. So I'm working on that.
What, if anything specific, is that photograph painting represent?
Oh, that's, okay. This is the book cover that the publisher chose that I would never have chosen myself. That is John Trumbull's picture of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And, it's a nice picture, but it's on the cover of like 50 other books. This was the first book I published with this particular publisher, and one of the first book I published with like a really good commercial publisher, and I learned a lot about the whole game. One thing I learned is do your own proofreading really, really, really well, because there are some copy editing issues with this book that I just assumed the copy editor would pick up on, and the copy editor didn't. And I would have been assertive about a cover design because I'm not crazy about this. It's a great picture, but it's a really, really, really super well-known picture, and we could do better.
Is the picture wrapped around the back?
No, it is not. That's probably from the hardcover. The back of it has this really neat recruiting poster from the 88th Regiment of Foot in 1779, 1780, and that's the kind of thing I like. I mean, it doesn't make a good, that's actually not what's on the back cover of this edition. That was on the hardcover, sorry. But there's a cool picture on the spine. That's the kind of picture I would have chosen. This one has a really nice picture that I did choose that has British soldiers in an encampment. But the back of it has a picture that's in every other book on the American Revolution. So, you do what you can. When you get a publishing contract, one of the things you have to do is say, got to pick your battles now, because you're going to get things where the publisher wants this and you want that, and you have to say, which things am I just going to say, you have it your way, because there's going to be some things where I don't necessarily want it my way. Other questions?
Seems as if the English record keeping was quite good.
Seems as if the English record keeping was quite good. Well, sort of. One of the things, if you really get into primary source research, one of the things you find right away is you're always wishing you had some other stuff besides what you actually have. So we have these wonderful British Army muster rolls that tell me the names of the soldiers. So I can tell you the name of every British soldier who served in Rhode Island during the war. I would like to know how old they were and where they were from and how tall they were and maybe what they looked like. Well, every British regiment kept what they called a description book that recorded that information. That would be really cool, except the muster rolls were important so the soldiers could get paid. So copies of those records all got sent back to the War Office because they ultimately have to reconcile who are we paying and how much are we paying them. But the description books, the only people who care about that is the regiment. They need a description, so if a guy deserts, they can advertise him as a... Those don't survive. We know those records were kept, and now they no longer exist. So it's like, oh, rats. So guys who got pensions, well, every British soldier ultimately got this discharge document, unless he died or deserted, but the only ones of those that survive are the ones for soldiers who got pensions. And even those, only guys who got pensions after 1785, because apparently somebody at some point in the history of the pension office had the bright idea to say, we don't need these older ones anymore. So there's a whole bunch of British soldiers who served in Rhode Island who got pensions, and I know because they kept a record book of who got the pensions, but they didn't keep the discharges, except for the ones who were discharged after 1785. That means all the guys who got wounded in the Battle of Rhode Island and got discharged right away because of their wounds and went back, I know their names, I know they got pensions, but I don't have those nice discharge records that tell me more detail about them. So there are a lot of records, but there's never enough records. You know this, right? There's never enough records because once you start doing the research, you find out all the records that were kept compared to what actually survived. So I shouldn't sound like a complainer because it's great that we've got what we've got. But boy, there's an awful lot that I know didn't survive. Other questions?
When a person gets a pension, do you have any idea of the amount of coins it was?
Oh, yes.
The value?
I have a very precise idea. In fact, there's a chapter in a book here dedicated to that very subject. But yeah, yes, he got 5/8 of his normal pay as a soldier. So how much was that? Well, a British soldier earned about £1 a month, which doesn't sound like a lot, and people write about, oh, the measly pay, because a British tradesman at that time could earn about £1 a day, which works out to about £1.50 a month. So the soldier is earning about 50% less than a common worker. And people just look at that alone and say, oh, pay, bad. But then I think, well, wait a minute, let's back up a minute. Okay, a British soldier does have to pay for his clothing and his food out of his pay. That's a common deduction, which is still true of soldiers today, right? You join the army, they issue you a uniform, but then you still got to pay for that stuff. It's not all free. And your food and whatnot, you know, terms like DFAC, if you've been in the army, will be familiar. But people look at this and I say, well, okay, so if you look at bad literature, it just says, well, gosh, a British soldier gets paid only 2/3 of what a laborer gets, and he has to pay for his food and his clothing. Well, the laborer also has to pay for his food and his clothing. But the British soldier doesn't have to pay for lodging, which everybody else does have to pay for. And this British soldier's pay of about £1 a month is a base pay, but a soldier can earn a lot of money above and beyond that. You remember the British built fortifications around here, like the one up on Butts Hill and other ones. When a British soldier was doing that kind of work, they got extra money for doing that labor over and above their base pay. So if you're a good soldier and you get a lot of these work details, you can make quite a lot of money. Again, I talk about this in the book. There's a lot of literature that just looks at things on the surface and gets an inaccurate impression of it. But some of these soldiers, you don't get rich as a soldier, but you're not starving to death either. And some soldiers did build up a fair amount of money over a long career. The pension, to get back to it, is 5/8 of what your actual pay would be. And this is a reason some of these soldiers went into these things like garrison battalions after the war, because then they go back up to their full pay. They go off the pension rolls, but they go back to full pay again. Other questions? Sorry, I kind of rambled on that one a little bit, but you get the idea. You get me on a hot button topic, and I'll start to babble. Any other questions? Thank you all very, very much.